You all hear me well? Yeah, good. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Many thanks for inviting me. As Will was saying, I am with the U.S. Institute of Peace. I know when I present myself, I hear different things. Oh, this is adorable. This is charming. But we do things and we work in countries where the outlook is not particularly adorable or charming. So we at the Institute are dedicated to the proposition that peace is possible, and we try to think and publish about ways in which we can get better at managing conflict. So that's what we do at the Institute. I wanted to talk to you today about how we are currently exploring complexity and trying to incorporate a number of principles from complexity theory into the type of work that we do. So the perspective that I will give you is that of a practitioner who's been working on peace processes in conflict-affected environments. So I come from a very different world. So my suggestion is to structure my presentation into three sections. The first one, the first part of the presentation is one where I'd like to explain to you how I came and how some of us at the Institute came to explore complexity in the field of peace building. The reason why we came to explore complexity is essentially linked to failure. And I would call it, it was a reaction or a hangover from some form of peace building illusions that we entertained and with which we had been working in the 1990s. So in order to tell you a bit about that failure, I want to tell you a story, and I will ask you to bear with me because it's a complicated story, and it's the story that is linked to the time where I worked in Bosnia and Herzegovina on the implementation of the peace process in Bosnia. So I will take a number of shortcuts as I try to summarize the complexity of the situation. So I ask that you bear with me. So as some of you may know, between 1992 and 1995, war and armed conflict ravaged Bosnia and Herzegovina. And Bosnia, before the war, was a federal unit in a larger federation that was composed of several federal units, similar to states here in the United States. And that federation was called Yugoslavia. At the beginning of the 1990s, several of those units decided to declare themselves independent. And Bosnia was one of those federal units that decided to declare itself independent. And what happened is Bosnia's two larger neighbors, namely Croatia and Serbia, started military campaigns that sought to dismantle Bosnia and Herzegovina and annex territories in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the war in Bosnia ended in 1995, in November 1995, with the ratification of the Dayton Peace Agreement that was signed here in Dayton, Ohio, after a US-led diplomatic effort that was led by Richard Holbrooke here in the United States. And the country emerged from the war as with a very complex constitutional architecture. It had a very weak central government that tried to stitch the country back together and was composed of two entities, one of which was a federation in itself. So a very complex constitutional structure as the country emerged from the war. And the Dayton Peace Agreement provided for an international military presence, a NATO-led military presence to ensure that the country remained stable after the signature of the peace agreement, but it also provided for an authority called the Office of the High Representative that was responsible for the implementation of the civilian aspects of the peace agreement. So that is the organizations where I work. And the organization had a tremendous amount of power. We had the power to impose legislation or amend legislation when we saw that the peace process was being disrupted or blocked. So I worked, if you still follow me, in the legal department of that organization. And part of the strategy that we were pursuing in Bosnia at the time, and we did that for almost 10 years, was a strategy that we came to call state building. And the idea behind state building was the central level of government was so weak that we shepherded and supported a number of reforms, taxation, the army, intelligence services, that sought to strengthen the weak level of government in Bosnia. So by 2007, we were sitting in Sarajevo trying to figure out a way to leave the peace implementation process and put Bosnia, at the time that's how we called it, on its European integration path, so that Bosnia would leave the system of international supervision and would become a country aspiring to integrate the European Union. So that was the strategy that we were pursuing in 2007. And there was one big obstacle left for that strategy to work, and that obstacle was what we call police reform. So for many years, we had worked with Bosnian authorities. We had created a commission that recommended a broad restructuring of Bosnia and Herzegovina's police forces. And the aim of the police restructuring reform was to move responsibilities from those lower units to the central level of government, so that we would strengthen and cement the central level of government with responsibilities over the police. There was one part of the country that saw things differently. So one of the entities in Bosnia was aggressively lobbying and trying to undermine that reform. And that was the majority Bosnian Serb unit in the country, because they saw that as essentially the dismantling of what they had acquired through armed conflict. So they were extremely reluctant to see police move to the central level of government. So we sat in Sarajevo and we tried to figure out, how do we go through that hurdle? How do we get all those parties to agree on police reform in a post-war country? And so the strategy we came up with was as follows. We said, well, we will coerce them. We will put pressure on the Bosnian Serb entity and try to put pressure on them so that they decide, well, better see the international supervision system go, and we will agree to police reform, and that will be the price that we have to pay in order to get rid of the international supervision. And we decided to do this by going after a number of rules of procedures in the Parliamentary Assembly and in government that the Bosnian Serb entities would rely on in order to block decisions at the central level. So we said we will modify those rules of procedures. We will make it harder for them to invoke veto. So you can imagine an international actor trying to essentially dismantle a number of vetoes that Congress here has, or members of Congress have, to block legislation. So that's essentially what we were trying to do. So the plan was very linear. So we said we will do this, they will feel the pressure, and the result of that is they will say, okay, we will agree to police reform, and that is the price that we will have to pay. So what happened? So I was leading the legal team that designed and conceived the amendments to those rules of procedures. And it was a very complicated legal landscape, and we worked for weeks on trying to find ways to amend the rules of procedures in a way that protected the constitutional vetoes, but simply made it harder procedurally to invoke. And we spent a lot of time on doing that. And we thought we were extremely smart, because we came up with a technical solution that we thought was sophisticated, and we felt good about ourselves and our product. And so we went ahead and we imposed amendments to those rules of procedures. The next day, the equivalent of the president of the federal unit gave a press conference and immediately challenged the legality and the constitutionality of the amendments that we had imposed ourselves. And for the first time challenged the authority of the High Representative and said, this system of international supervision should come to an end. They have no mandate. They shouldn't be able to impose laws in our country. So it came out very strongly. A week later, the Bosnian Serb chairman of the Council of Ministers, so the head of the government, resigned and brought down with him the entire government of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And there's a quote when he resigned that was reported in the Financial Times. He said, if the international community always supports the High Representative, then it doesn't matter if I'm the head of that state or Bart Simpson. And those were his last words before he resigned and brought the entire executive branch of government at the federal level down with him. Then the Bosnian Serb entity, all the representatives from the Bosnian Serb entities decided to boycott the Parliamentary Assembly and brought the entire Central Parliament to a standstill. And we thought that things were not going well, and you can see how our brilliant plan was unfolding. But then things got worse because we thought that this would be contained to Bosnia, but it turned out differently. What happened at the same time is that the president of Serbia, the neighboring country that intervened in Bosnia during the war, made a statement by which he linked the efforts that we were undertaking in Bosnia to the process that the international community was supervising in Kosovo to accompany Kosovo and to accompany Kosovo as it was trying to become independent from Serbia. And so the president of Serbia linked those two issues, and then calls started coming from Washington, from European capitals, saying, we're working very hard on Kosovo. What are you guys doing in Bosnia? We have no interest whatsoever in having these two issues being linked. This is becoming way too unstable for us, so on and so forth. So our international backers started to be divided. Then Russia, a few days later, decided to leave the Peace Implementation Council, the consensus on the Peace Implementation Council, and sided with the Bosnian Serbs. So after 4 weeks, our brilliant plan led to the following situation. The High Representative had to take back the amendments, essentially, and withdraw the substance of the amendments. And we kept them in place, but we amended the amendment in order to render them ineffective, which essentially was the end of international authorities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So after a few weeks only, as we were trying to secure agreement to police reform died. We brought down the entire system of international supervision in Bosnia. We emboldened secessionist forces in Bosnia, and we saw a resurgence of wartime dynamics between neighboring countries and Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we did really, really well. So that I smile now and I laugh, and it would be funny if we were not meant to be managing a peace process and in a place where our responsibility was to ensure that the country was stable and was moving away from conflict dynamics. It had a big toll on me personally because I was involved intimately with that process. And so what I did, after that I went to Kosovo and I worked on the legal process by which Kosovo became independent, and so I did that for 2 years. And after that I went to Cambridge and I wrote a book about this crisis, trying to extract a number of lessons from that crucial moment in 2007, because I felt deeply down inside that we had failed, and that we had failed spectacularly, and I felt a big part of the responsibility for that. And this is when I became personally interested in notions of complexity. As I was researching this book, I came across literature and work, and as a practitioner who had been thrown into conflict dynamics and peace processes, it is a line of thinking that really resonated strongly and deeply with me. It made sense based on what I had seen as a practitioner. And so there were a number of takeaways for me from Bosnia and from that crisis, and I talk about them in this book. The first one is I think we were really a victim of a number of very naive and linear assumptions about our own power, but also about the dynamics of post-war countries. And I can illustrate that with a few examples. The first one is we were clearly maintaining very static and linear perceptions of power, of our own power. And we were assuming that because a peace agreement had a number of provisions that gave us power, that this was essentially a fixed quantity or a fixed capacity that was vested with us. And we could exercise it at will. We could reassert power, we could exercise some more. And we had a number of assumptions about the political dynamics where people would, and politicians would continue behaving in exactly the same way as they had done for the last 10 years. And so we failed to understand power in a more complex, nuanced ways, and seeing power as the product of a relationship that we were maintaining with the local population, and that we were competing in that relationship, and that power was a product of consent, of people consenting to seeing outsiders exercising a stabilizing authority in their country, and that this consent could be withdrawn. I also came to realize, thinking about this, and realize the limits of a peace process or a peace model that is contingent on an outside, foreign, top-down authority that is very much involved in diagnosis what the problems are, designing what the reforms should be, and trying to enforce those types of reforms in a local context, because that's pretty much what we were doing in Bosnia for 10 years. And another thing that I realized as I was researching and writing this book is that nothing is purely technical in a conflict-affected environment. And so while we were approaching those reforms by looking at police structures and the ratio of police versus population and maps and the efficiency of a common procurement system, what I think we completely underestimated as we were working on these reforms is how these reforms were having a deep impact on positions and interests of parties who were still waging conflict through nonviolent means after the end of the war. And so with each of those reforms, we were impacting a whole dynamic of competition for power, and people were reacting to this. And we knew that some of our reforms were doing that. But what we failed to, I think, fully realize and appreciate is the deep emotional dynamics in a post-war society where fear of subjugation, mistrust, and divergent interpretations of history are a factor of life. And the extent to which it is very difficult to try to predict with full accuracy how a specific actor in a system will be reacting. And this idea that we could look at, that we could assume that politicians would look at cost and benefits, I think is an idea that was completely naive. And while we were operating at a technical level, people on the receiving end of those reforms were clearly analyzing and positioning themselves vis-a-vis their position in conflict, and on the basis of very, very deeply held emotions. So for those reasons, I started to be interested in complexity. And then I joined the US Institute of Peace, and my surprise is that I found there a group of practitioners who had pretty much gone through very similar processes in the 1990s, be it in Afghanistan, be it in Iraq, or in Bosnia, or in Kosovo. And so there was this common realization among practitioners that peace can be possible, but it's extremely complex. And those large efforts that we had led, where we were trying to manage very closely those conflict environments, had some successes, but in many cases had failed, and had failed quite spectacularly. So we became very interested in trying to learn from that experience. And so what we started doing at the Institute is we explored complexity, and we looked at a number of basic principles of complexity and tried to design a different approach for peace building that would allow us to be more effective. And so what we started testing for the last 5 or 6 years is a model by which we try to design interventions in very, very flexible ways. And so we refrain from prescribing or diagnosing what the problems are and what the solutions are, but instead we design projects at a local level where we bring people together and we transfer the power of diagnosis and the power of solution to the very people who are grappling with a specific problem in their community. And we design the approach in a way where we try to leave as much space as possible for them to fail, self-correct, and adapt, and try to learn as they go along. And we try to provide technical support when those needs manifest themselves as they try to solve those problems. And we've been testing this approach in several countries. We're currently testing it in 6 different countries in West Africa. That is Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Nigeria, as well as in Tunisia. And the approach has led to a number of important successes and outcomes. And one example that I can give you is we've tested this approach in Iraq for the last 5 or 6 years. And what started in Iraq as a very small project, a community police trust reinforcement project, has led recently to the signature of an agreement by 600 tribal leaders in Iraq, by which they all agreed that they would stop using informal, traditional justice mechanisms to undermine the work of the police and the court system in Iraq. And they also, through that agreement, all agreed that women would no longer be used as an instrument to settle disputes between tribes. And that came from, as a result of a small local project that we started in a specific city in Iraq. And so those kinds of outcomes that are emerging from the interactions of local actors who start trusting each other and who come to discover a number of solutions is the type of things that we're very interested in. I would lie to you if I were to say that we've been successful in every single experimentation or application of this approach. We haven't. And one example, and I can give you a number of illustrations of the types of challenge that we're facing. We are facing challenges as we're trying to do this because I think that regardless of the approach that we're using, and even if we are getting better at managing risk and uncertainty in those environments, risk is an inherent part of those environments. And we cannot fully expunge uncertainty and risk as we try to shepherd reforms in those environments. And I'll give you 3 illustrations. There are some security contexts where the model that we've been trying has stopped working. And the example there is in Libya. When Libya opened up, we went to Libya, designed what we call justice and security dialogue approach for Libya, and we started implementing the approach, and it worked to a certain extent. But as the security situation in Libya worsened, and as the country fell into a deep civil war, then the security risk prevented us from implementing the model. There was no way that we could bring people together because people were either unable to come physically, or the tensions between communities or actors were so high that they were simply unwilling or unable to come together and solve very, very specific local problems. So our approach does not work in all contexts, and it requires a certain level of stability and a certain amount of security risk to work. Another challenge that we're facing as we're trying to implement this approach is vis-a-vis partners or a number of members of the leadership of different organizations who have a very low tolerance for risk for a number of reasons. So when we test these approaches, we use public funds voted by Congress. And so there's a tremendous amount of pressure on people working at the Institute, but generally in this field, for designing projects in ways that are managing these funds very responsibly. So the linear models and the linear assumptions where we try to expunge risk and design projects that can lead to very quick outputs and outcomes and that can be measured very thoroughly, the pressure is very high to do that. So it's very difficult for us to design and find partnerships in order to push that approach forward. So that's one of the challenges that we face that is linked to risk, but perceptions of risk for people who would be willing to back those efforts or to finance those efforts. And then there's another risk as well that we're grappling with, and that risk is linked to worries that we have that sometimes as we go through these more adaptive approaches that we may run the risk of making things even worse at times. And I can give you an example. In one of the country in West Africa where we're working, we've decided to work in a community where there's a lot of tension between vigilante groups and the police. And it is seen as a symptom of state fragility. The state is not strong enough to ensure security for its citizens, and so you have a number of vigilante or informal security groups that have mushroomed in this country. So we decided to go and work on a process by which we would bring together members of the community, the police, and members of those vigilante groups so that they start working together. And initially, we were successful. So when we started the process, they didn't want to be in the same room. So it took through some facilitation and dialogue techniques some time for us to convince them to be in the same room and to talk to each other. And they finally ended up sitting together and talking to each other. And they started collaborating with one another, which we saw as a big success. One of the problems that we're facing in this place is that the vigilante group will tend to take justice in their own hands. And so the level of trust in the security system is so low that when they catch a thief or someone who they suspect has committed a criminal offense, rather than bringing that individual to the police, lynching or beatings or these kinds of dynamics are very common. So one of the things that we try to work with them on is to provide human rights training, legal training, so that these vigilante groups understood what, according to the law, the process was when you caught someone and when you brought that person to the police. And then they started cooperating with the police and bringing individuals to the police. But then we started worrying that relationship that they built with the police would make the police more reluctant to intervene when some of those vigilante groups would take matters in their own hands, because they'd be more concerned about the stability of the community and the relationship that they were now building with those vigilante groups. So we find at times ourselves in these very difficult, concrete situations where we do manage and face a whole series of interactions and very complex dynamics that we have to deal with. And so that means that despite your best effort, and even if you want to embrace a more adaptive approach as you try to manage risks and stabilities in those environments, that you do face situations where risk is inherent. People can come to the wrong solution. It may take a tremendous amount of time to get back to a position where you are making progress. So those are the very concrete examples that I wanted to give you, and to give you the perspective of how practitioners are trying to learn from complexity theory in order to design and implement very concrete and simple ways in which we can be better at supporting reforms in those environments.